was going to talk about God's ideal man and God's ideal woman, but that most likely I would just talk about God's ideal man. And I'm sure that is as far as we are going to get. I'll be honest with you and tell you, though, that the reason I want to preach this is because I want to talk about God's ideal woman. And one of the reasons I want to do that is, I think, and I've got to tell you, as a preacher of the gospel, who is given the responsibility to preach everything that is needful, that some of us are losing sight of the relationship God ordained of men and women, of what men are and of what women are. And so I will go eventually, probably in a couple of weeks, to the subject of God's ideal woman. And I want you to follow very carefully. And if you think I have not properly represented what is in the Bible, then you tell me about it and we will talk about that. But it is a Bible subject. And I think it is easy for us to be influenced by the culture about us today. And we are not carefully enough taking God's ideal as the pattern. But you know, as I think about that then, I look at those of us who are men and I can say, that part of the subject is needed too. And so I'm happy to start with that. But when I talk about God's ideal man, let me tell you where I have borrowed deeply for this lesson. In the lectures this year, it was Paul Earnhardt's subject to speak on from wisdom literature, God's ideal man and God's ideal woman. And I was impressed much by what he said, and I think it was one of the more enjoyable lectures that I heard this year. And as I heard him speak, I thought, how in the world are you going to get that in 45 minutes? And he did, but he was speaking to an audience where he could say, remember Nabal? And he did not have to go into a discussion of Nabal and who Nabal was and what Nabal's problem was. Everybody knew. And so when you take that kind of lesson and present it, you must go, because we have visitors and we have other people who may not be familiar with that, and so you have to take time to go into it. So I'm not preaching Paul's lesson, but I am using some of his material. I have a couple of quotations that I got from him, and I found the information helpful, and I am going to use the example that he used. And that is, in looking at God's ideal man, he took for his example Job. And I'll explain why, and I also am going to take Job. But as we talk about God's ideal man, we're really talking about a man commended by God as an ideal for us, showing us what ideally we ought to be. And there's going to be a difference in God's ideal man and that we see on television talk shows. Quite obviously, I think that is. We need ideals. We will never reach higher than our ideals. And the higher and the nobler our ideas are, the greater achievement there is going to be. If my ideals are very low, I will be content to reach that, even though I may never reach them. But when my ideals are very high and very lofty, I will strive then for great achievement. I like this quotation that I borrowed from Paul, that he borrowed from a man who ended up in the 1800s being editor of a New York City newspaper. And he said, ideals are like stars. You will not touch them with your hands. But like the seafaring man on the desert of waters, you will choose them as your guide, and following them you will reach your destiny. The sailor, anciently, without radar and other equipment, had to sail by the stars. And this writer says that is what our ideals are like. We may not touch them with our hands, but we'll use them to sail after, to follow after them, and follow them to our destiny. The better our ideals, the further we will reach. Our study, as I have already indicated, is going to come from the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. Sometimes they are called the books of poetry, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. and even classified as a book of wisdom. I think the Song of Solomon. There is so much wisdom packed in these books, and that is what characterizes them. And as we look at those books, we think, but they are Israel scriptures. They are for the Jews. No, these books, even though they were Israel scriptures, do not speak to men as Jews. They speak to people as human beings. The message in those books is a universal message. And when we talk about ideal men and ideal women, we see that ideal humanity is at the center of God's purpose. In a world full of wonders, man and woman in God's ideal is special. Even man and woman, not in God's ideal, potentially is special. In 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter, verses 9 and 10, of God's people, his ideal men and women, maybe all of them have not yet reached that ideal, but striving for it, he said, you are an elect race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, that you might show forth the excellencies of him that called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. In Christians, God has a people saved from their sins, redeemed, and they are a special people. And this is what God had in mind. God had in mind a people who would fit him, who were peculiar to him, who were characteristic of him. And one translation says a peculiar people, another characteristic of God. And this is what God wanted from the beginning. Sin spoiled that, but in Jesus Christ, God has achieved that. Ideal men and women in Jesus Christ as we conform to what God is. There are special qualities for men in the Bible, and there are special qualities for women in the Bible. Man and woman in God's view, in God's creation, are different, and they are different in more than just physical anatomy. And in a world blurred concerning sexual identity, in a world of homosexual lifestyle, of unisex, in a world full of feminist rhetoric, we need to know what we are. As men, we need to know what we are. As women, we need to know what we are. Now I'm going to go to Job. Of course, I could say God's ideal man, Jesus Christ, and that is true. And certainly Jesus Christ surpassed Job. But if I look at a human being and I want to see a person who has been described as perfect and upright, I need look no further than Job. And in Job, the 1st chapter, in verse 1 and in verse 8, he is described in both of those verses as perfect, upright. He feared God. He turned away from evil. The word translated perfect means mature. This is not a person who is just endeavoring and reaching towards some of the qualities God wants him to have. This is not a neophyte. It is not a novice. It is not a new convert. Here is a man who is mature before God, that God can look at and see him in full grownness, being what God wants him to be. When it says that he is upright, it is a word that would be similar to he is a straight shooter. You can trust this man. You can depend upon what he says. And he feared God and turned away from evil. In Ezekiel, the 14th chapter, in verse 14 and in verse 20, Ezekiel warning concerning the destruction of Jerusalem, he was saying, so sure is it that even if Noah and Daniel and Job were there, they would not be able to save it. So here are 3 outstanding characters of righteousness. Job was one of them. In the book of Job, he is described as perfect and upright. Job was not a Jew. Job was a non-Jewish Semite living in the patriarchal age and world of Genesis. He lived before Moses. He lived before the nation of Israel. He was a man in the earth just as we are men in the earth. Job is not remembered for some specific heroic act, as was Moses. As Moses went into Pharaoh and demanded, let my people go. Nor is he remembered for a single heroic act as David As David, as a young man, went down to the brook and took the stones and slew the giant Goliath, as he cursed God, that is, the giant Goliath cursed God, and as he spoke against Israel. David, Moses, remembered for some great act of heroism. Job can be remembered for his heroism also, though it is not one single act that you can put your finger on. Rather, in Job, we'll remember him for his character. He endured through great loss, suffering, and long adversity, when this suffering seemed contrary to all reason. And his friends told him if he were righteous, he would not be suffering as he was. And Job lost his confidence and wondered, and he began to complain to God concerning the things that he suffered that he did not understand, but there was a character that undergirded his strength and kept him faithful to God even when he didn't understand. And he was finally reduced simply to professing his righteousness and saying how he had lived in the kind of character that characterized him. And that character is what we remember Job for, and that character is what God was referring to when he spoke of Job as a perfect and an upright man. Job stood against Satan's onslaught, but his friends began to wear him down, and he began to complain against God. We're going to the 31st chapter, and this is after the first three friends have spoken in their series of speeches to Job, and he has tried to answer them. And he is finally reduced to saying this: you tell me I must be unrighteous, but here's the kind of life I have lived. And he will go through a series: if I have done this, if I have done that, if I have done the other, then let these curses come upon me. And in all of this, he is asserting the kind of character that he possesses. And so here is Job's defense. Here is the description of this man whom God says is perfect and upright. And the first thing I want us to note about him begins there in the first verse. This is Job chapter 31, beginning with verse 1. I made a covenant with mine eyes. How then should I look upon a virgin? Job, a married man, was a chaste man. He saw lustful sexual pursuit as a heinous crime, as iniquity. Further down into the chapter, in this 31st chapter, look at verse 9. If my heart hath been enticed unto a woman, and I have laid in wait at my neighbor's door. And we come on down to verse 11. For that were a heinous crime, yet it were an iniquity to be punished by the judges. He said, it is not even worthy of me to look to pursue another woman. I have made a covenant with mine eyes. I will not look upon the virgin. This was a man of chastity, of loyalty to his principles, of loyalty to his God. And he realized that he could sin in his heart and his purposes in pursuing someone even before the act was committed. Does that sound familiar to you? In Job, there is anticipated Matthew the 5th chapter and verse 28, where Jesus said that the man that looks upon a woman to lust after her has committed adultery already with her in his heart. To look to a woman and after a woman to pursue her, sin already in that intention to pursue or to lust after her. And Job said the same thing. And he said, I have not done that. I made a covenant with my eyes. His covenant with his wife had determined this covenant with his eyes. The book of Proverbs has much to say about chastity, and while we're in these books of wisdom, let us turn there, and I want you to turn to the 5th chapter of Proverbs. There are many lengthy readings in Proverbs that are really interesting along this line. We will not have time for all of them, but let us take just a bit. Proverbs 5, beginning in verse 18. Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice in the wife of thy youth. As a loving hind and a pleasant doe, let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. For why shouldst thou, my son, be ravished with a strange woman and embrace the bosom of a foreigner? Be true to your wife. And Job said, I have been true to my wife. I even made a covenant with mine eyes that they would not pursue and pleasure and seek after my neighbor's wife or even the young virgins. He was being true to the covenant that he had first of all made with his wife and the covenant that he had even earlier made with his God. There is another passage, and I don't think I got this written down in my outline, if I could spot it very quickly. Yes, in the 7th chapter of Proverbs, beginning in verse 22. Proverbs 7, verse 22. Here is the man. Here is the stud of that day, as he is seen in the book of Proverbs. He goeth after her straightway. It is the woman that entices him and draws him onward. He goeth after her straightway as an ox goeth to the slaughter. In pursuing this immorality, he is like the dumb ox, doing what he thinks is pleasurable and good for him, only to be slaughtered. And it says, or as one in fetters to the correction of the fool, till an arrow shall strike through his liver, as a bird hasteth to the snare, and knoweth not it is for his life. Here is the man who gives himself to pleasure, who pursues his immorality. The book of Proverbs says he is like a dumb ox pursuing this. Do you want some examples? How about Gary Hart? How about Magic Johnson? How about Bill Clinton? How about Mike Tyson? Or how about Jim Baker? How about Jimmy Swaggart? All of these verses well describe them. They may have thought they were being manly. They may have thought they were being a blessing to the women that they pursued and caught. But they were like a dumb ox going to the slaughter. The books of wisdom tell us to not make that same mistake. Job said, I have made a covenant with mine eyes, and he would be true to that. But someone said, but Job's wife was a shrew. It didn't matter. He took a vow, and as being a servant of God who keeps covenant according to Deuteronomy, the 7th chapter, he would keep covenant. It was his wife, and he made promises to her, and whatever her character, whether she were a shrew or not, he would be faithful whatever she was. Job was a chaste man. In this area, there is a picture of God's ideal man. Back then to the book of Job, to this 31st chapter, where Job discusses what he has been, which makes him wonder at all of the suffering that he is doing. Look at verse 5. If I have walked with falsehood, and my foot hath hasted to deceit, let me be weighed in an even balance, that God may know mine integrity. What he is saying is, I have not been a liar. I have not used deceit. I have not been a hypocrite. I have been open, and I have been honest with others. While we are in this section, we will do some flipping, and let us flip back now to the book of Proverbs, to the 6th chapter, to see some other comments on the necessity of speaking the truth, of being open and being forthright, of being honest. Proverbs 6, beginning in verse 16. There are 6 things which Jehovah hateth, yea, 7, which are an abomination to him. Here are 6 things God hates, 7 indeed, that are an abomination to him. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that deviseth wicked purposes, feet that are swift in running to mischief, a false witness that uttereth lies, and he that soweth discord among the brethren. But there we have a lying tongue. We have a false witness that uttereth lies. Job can say, this did not characterize me. I was surprised at something Darrell told me during the lectureship. One night he didn't come in. He happened to be staying at the same place we were. And we were curious the next day of what kept him out so late. And he said, we stayed up till late talking with this young man we wanted to baptize over in one of the dormitories at school. And he said he's got a long way to go. He said he had a concept that socially there's a problem with lying. But even though he has gone to church all his life, and this is a 15-year-old, he didn't really know that God condemned lying, that it was a sin a person could go to hell for. Well, here are some passages that emphasize that to us, if any of us had not recognized that, and it was not something that characterized Job. Job did not do that. He would not follow flattering hypocrisy. In Proverbs, the 27th chapter and verse 6, it speaks of what our friends may say to us. It speaks of what the hypocrite would say to us. And I had to look back to check where that was. It is Proverbs chapter 27 and verse 6, an interesting passage. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are profuse. The enemy may kiss, the enemy may flatter, the enemy may be your friend. That is not helpful, it is even destructive. Better to have the wounds of a friend. They can be helpful. Of course, there's also something to be said about the wounds of an enemy. They sometimes don't feel so good. But the idea is, do not listen to hypocrisy, do not be overcome by it. And Job said, I did not do that. If I have walked with falsehood, and my foot hath hasted to deceit, then bring these curses upon me. Job simply did not live like that. God's ideal man was not only chaste, God's ideal man was truthful and forthright with others. Also, God's ideal man is a just person. In the 31st chapter, beginning in verse 13, Job says, if I have despised the cause of my manservant or my maidservant, when they contended with me, Job could say, yes, in the course of life, I have had people working for me, and they have not always felt that I have treated them rightly. Maybe their cause was not just, but I would listen to them. If they contended with me, if they argued with me, if they said, Job, this is not right, or this is not wise, Job said, what then shall I do when God raiseth up, and when he visiteth, what shall I answer him? Did not he that made me in the womb make him my servant? And did not one fashion us in the womb? Job said, I have been fair and just. I have treated others justly, even my servants. And when they contended with me, I would listen to them. I listened to them for two reasons. One is, the God that made him made me. And the God that made me is the same one who made my servant. But then also this point, if I will not listen to my servant, how shall I do when I want God to listen to me? And there's another New Testament passage that is anticipated there in 1 Peter, the 3rd chapter and verse 7, where a man is told to dwell with his wife in knowledge, giving her special honor. And if he did not, the passage said, lest your prayers be hindered. And the idea is, again, that the man being put in the position of being the leader in the family, if he will not listen to his wife, if he cannot be moved by what she says, because he says, I am in the superior position, I will do what I say and I will do what I think, then when that man turns to God and he looks to someone who is indeed his superior and he begins to make his appeals to God, God says, if you will not listen to your wife, why should I listen to you? Job said, if I will not listen to my servant, why should God listen to me? And so Job was a just man. He treated others with fairness. Now in this chapter, come down to verse 16, and we see another characteristic of Job, that he was a merciful man. If I have withheld the poor from their desire, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, she sees her need, and I do not grant it. Or have eaten my morsel alone, and the fatherless hath not eaten thereof, to sit before the fatherless and the needy children out at the gate perhaps, and eat my lunch, and let them be hungry. And then he goes ahead to say, then let these curses be brought upon me. Job was a merciful man, but not only to the poor and to the widow and to the orphan. But look at verse 29 beginning. Job 31 beginning in verse 29. If I have rejoiced at the destruction of him that hated me, or lifted up myself when evil found him. Job's mercy extended even to his enemies, and he would not rejoice at the destruction of his enemies. He wouldn't lift himself up when evil was found in his enemy. He was not that arrogant and haughty and boastful. He could feel for his enemy. Job was a merciful man. And then he goes ahead to say in verse 30, Yea, I have not suffered my mouth to sin by asking his life with a curse. I have not sought to bring God's curses even upon my enemy. That is something that even David did. That is something that we often may feel compelled to do as we look at our enemies about us, and we can even feel as we study in the book of Jeremiah, the desire for God's justice to be brought upon them. Job said, I have not even rejoiced over the conquering and the hurt of my enemy. Mercy, perfect man, an upright man. The book of Proverbs reflects this in Proverbs 25 and verse 21. If your enemy hunger, give him bread. If he thirst, give him drink. Where have you heard that? You have heard that in Romans the 12th chapter and verse 20. And these Old Testament books anticipating that which would be revealed to us and spoken by the Apostle Paul. Next, as you come to the 33rd verse, Job chapter 31 and verse 33, we find the idea of Job being the spiritual leader of his family. If, like Adam, I have covered my transgressions by hiding my iniquity in my bosom, because I feared the great multitude and the contempt of families terrified me, other families did not terrify Job. He was the proper leader of his family, and he did not have to fear the contempt of other families. In the first chapter in verse 5, we find before the other activities in the book take place that Job is offering sacrifice for his children. He was concerned with their standing before God. He was the spiritual leader in his family. In the 29th chapter, you find Job as he sits in the gate. You find the respect that he is accorded. He is one of the elders of the city, and people come to him for advice, and they listen to his judgments. This man knew the will of God, knew what God wanted in people, and he taught them. He was not only a spiritual leader in his family, spirituality was something he was constantly concerned with, and he expressed it to others. His life was an example that commanded respect until he was down, and then the vultures came. And if you stand for what is right, if you are ever down, you can expect that the vultures will be there, just as Job's friends turned in to such. But Job kept his integrity. Job remained a spiritual person, and he continued his spiritual leadership, even perhaps to the effect of saving his wife. One of the interesting observations that Paul made that I had not thought about is that we are harder on Job's wife than he was. We can all quote those words of Job, curse Job's wife as she said to him after he'd lost everything and reduced to the suffering that he was in, curse God and die. But in the second chapter in verse 10 he says, you speak as one of the foolish women. He did not say she was a foolish woman. In regard to what she has said, that was really a rather mild rebuke. And you know, when you get to the end of the book, Job has 10 more children to replace the children that he lost, but it does not mention a different or another wife. One would like to think that the spiritual leadership of Job and his godliness and his persevering in his faith toward God won the heart of his wife, and she came to have the same kind of faith and to eventually triumph as Job also did. But whatever, all this indicates that Job was the spiritual leader of his family, God's ideal man. is the spiritual leader of his family, and spiritual concerns are the apex of the concerns of his life. There are not many men like that in the world today. There are not many men who see that as a manly thing to do. But the God who made us, and the God before whom we will stand, and the God who gave the standards of manhood, regards that highly. And of this man, who was this spiritual, God said he is perfect and he is upright. But there's an undergirding integrity that made all of these characteristics possible. Look now in the 31st chapter at verse 24 beginning. And notice what Job's concerns were and what this undergirding characteristic of his life was. If I have made gold my hope, and have said to the fine gold, thou art my confidence, if I have rejoiced because my wealth was great, and because my hand had gotten much, if I had beheld the sun when it shined, or the moon walking in brightness, and this is an allusion evidently to the sun and moon worship so characteristic of the ancient world, and my heart hath been secretly enticed by that, and my mouth hath kissed my hand toward the sun and moon in reverence, this also were an iniquity to be punished by the judges, for I should have denied the God that is above. Job was not first of all concerned with this material world. He reverenced and trusted God above all created things. Man today seems to be drunk with the worship of nature, as he was outlined in Romans the 1st chapter also, as he worshiped the creature rather than the Creator who is blessed forever. Even the New Age is to bring man into harmony with the whole, with all of nature. And that is true of so many of these new religions that are coming out of the East and out of India. The idea is that we are no more important really than anything else that is here upon this earth, and we must just blend in with all of it. I know I mentioned to you 2 or 3 years ago of seeing a Jacques Cousteau film where a man swam down into the water in his scuba gear, and he came up close to a fish, and it says, man and fish, brothers, meet. That's ludicrous. We are not brothers with the fish. We have been given dominion over the fish and all that is here. We should do it wisely. But let us not see man as just another facet of creation. Man is the crowning glory of creation. He has been placed above it all. And all these religions simply are drunk with the worship of nature. God is not. Job was not. The things that are here, Job looked above all of them. He looked above the sun. He looked above the moon. He looked above his wealth. He looked above his gold. He looked to God. And it is that one characteristic that made all the rest of these characteristics that we have studied special and made them possible to him. The world is concerned so much today with the preservation of the resources of this planet. That is wise. But man has so lost his balance in that regard. He has neglected the spiritual resources which will keep this planet from judgment. And when those spiritual resources are gone, judgment will then come, and the spiritual resources are far more important than the air, the streams, or anything else. If I get cancer and die and go to heaven, I have triumphed. But if I save myself and live to be 150 years because cancer nor any other disease ever gets me until I just can't function anymore and go to hell, what did 40 or 50 years? What did 150 years on this earth mean? Nothing. I lost it all. I'm not saying we should pollute it. I'm saying I agree. There needs to be wisdom used in regard to it. But let us put the emphasis where it needs to be. Let us have this ungirding of this characteristic undergirding us, this faith in God above everything else. And that will keep things in perspective. Look quickly at the 28th chapter in verse 28 for something that was mentioned in the first chapter that we read there. And unto the man he said, behold, the fear of the Lord that is wisdom. And to depart from evil is understanding. Job feared God, and that granted him wisdom. This theme runs throughout these books of wisdom. Fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to depart from evil is understanding. Proverbs 1:7 says, the fear of Jehovah, this is the beginning of wisdom. Psalms 111:10 says, the fear of Jehovah is the beginning of wisdom. Ecclesiastes 12:13 says, this is the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole of man. This completes man. This tells man what he needs to know. This makes man what he is. To fear God and keep his commandments. Men who don't reverence God don't know. They do not understand life. In Romans, the 1st chapter, verses 21 and 22, here is man casting off his knowledge of God, professing himself to be wise, he became a fool. The more man has thought he knows about this universe, and the more he gives his answers rather than God, the less he knows about God, the less he knows about the purpose of life. He comes to the point to where he really doesn't know anything except all of the theories with which he is infatuated. In Proverbs, the 3rd chapter, in verses 5 and 6, we find more message about the wisdom and the knowledge that we have. If you'd like to turn there as we begin to bring these thoughts to a close. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. Trust in Jehovah with all thy heart, and lean not upon thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he will direct thy path. Job did that. He didn't understand. He began to question God, why these things were transpiring. It did not seem fair to him. In fact, it could be said that he began to make accusations against God. But he sought God in all his ways. And so God then, without telling him why he was suffering, began to remind Job of the things Job didn't know that God did know. He asked him questions about the heavens, about the earth, about biology, about zoology. Job did not know any of those answers, but he knew that God did. And he saw a pattern, and he saw that God was in control, and he saw the sovereignty of God. So then, without ever getting an answer, Lord, why did I lose my flocks? Why did I lose my herds? Why did I lose my wealth? Why did I lose my family? Why am I afflicted in my body? Job reflected, and he said, God is in control. God will do things well. I trust God. Blessed be his name. And so we come to the end of the book, to the 42nd chapter and verse 5, and Job said, I had heard of thee with the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye hath seen thee. Job said, I know you better than I ever did. My faith is stronger while I am still ailing and sick, while I still do not understand all of this. In broken-heartedness I come to you and love you more and understand you more than I ever did. Do what you will, I will trust you, is the significance of what Job said. That brings us to this last quality then of God's ideal man, and that is humility. Without discussing it at length, just take one verse from the New Testament, to James the 4th chapter and verse 6, that says something that is reflected many times in the Old Testament, in these books of wisdom. God resists the proud. He resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. What is a picture of God's ideal man? God's ideal man is chaste. He is truthful and upright and forthright. He is just and fair. He is merciful. He is the spiritual leader of his family. He has character that undergirds all his actions and causes him to do right. He fears God, and he is humble. Those are things for me to look at and to measure myself by and to strive for. Those are ideals we can look to as the stars and reach for. And with a pattern such as that, it will keep us busy reaching and growing. Let's not set our ideals too low. Now, as we come to the close of our service this evening, if there's one here who would come to God and share faith with Job in God and obey him and walk with him, we invite you to come. There's one here who has wandered from Christ and needs to come back to Christ. We also invite you to come and to obey the Lord and to come. Now, while together we stand and sing. I gave my life for thee, my spirit was I did, that thou might ransom me and quicken from the dead. I gave my life for thee, what hast thou given for me? I gave my life for thee, what hast thou given for me? My father's house of life, my glory's circle throne, I left for earthly night, for wandering sad and low. I left it all for thee, and thou left all for me. I left it all for thee, and thou left all for me. I hunger but for thee, more than thy tongue can tell. All vigorous agony to rescue thee from hell. I mourn it all for thee, what hast thou borne for me? I mourn it all for thee, what hast thou borne for me? And I have brought to thee down from my home above, salvation full and free, my pardon and my love. I bring with gifts to thee, what hast thou brought for me? I bring with gifts to thee, what hast thou brought for me? Last time Gary was that I said, if you preach, you could call somebody to close in prayer. And I forgot where we are. Is there anything anybody has to say further before we conclude this evening? When usually there is to be, after we had time to do dishes and stuff, there is to be a congregation meeting, finish up the business on the agenda. When we leave to close in prayer, please.
Shall we pray? Our Father in heaven, we come once more to thee, thanking thee that hast spared our lives, so that we can come to this place and worship thee, the only true and living God. May we take the lessons that we learned this day and this evening home with us and meditate upon them, and do likewise, as the Lord has said. Father, be with us and our adversaries, and Father, take us to our places of abode, and and be with us, and when thou art to sicken and die, wilt thou keep us at the blessed home of God, for we ask it in Jesus' name.